Welcome back to week 2 of our virtual read-along / book club for Kate DiCamillo's Flora and Ulysses, The Illuminated Adventures of Flora and Ulysses. This book club, book talk, read-along is actually taking place on a library resource called Tumblebooks. If you missed the first week, last week, we read the first 10 chapters together over on Tumblebooks, and you can find that video on the Sayville Library Facebook or the YouTube channel. There's also a video in there showing you how to access Tumblebooks, and we're gonna do like a quick mini preview of that right now. So I'm gonna show you how to get to there. Okay, so to do that, the very first thing we're gonna do is we're going to start on the Sayville Library website homepage, which is sayvillelibrary.org. We're going to click on the tab for the children's department, and we're going to scroll down to Tumblebooks. I talked in my video about Tumblebooks a little bit about some of these other library resources. They're all fantastic. They're really interesting. Be sure to check them out. For now, we're going to go directly to Tumblebooks for our reading. I'm going to click on eBooks. And once again, Kate DiCamillo is a beloved and a featured author on this website. And Flora and Ulysses, the book that we're currently reading, is the second book you see when you open this page. We're going to click read online because that's how we're accessing it. We're going to click read online because that's how we're accessing it and reading it together. And I mentioned before that we're going to read the next 2 chapter sections. So this book is broken up into just sections of 5 chapters to make it easier for you to flip through the book virtually. So we're going to jump right here to chapter 11 because last week we read chapter 10. And the only problem with reading it online is that it cuts off the very, very top of our chapter, so we don't see the chapter title, which isn't essential to our reading, but conveniently I do have the book here with me. And chapter 11 is titled A Gigantic Vat of Incandesto. And now we can get reading. So chapter 11. She put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there in the bright overhead light. He also looked pretty bald. Good grief, said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look very heroic. But then neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor, Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed relieved to see it. He lowered his nose and sniffed along the length of it. I'm hoping that you can understand me, said Flora. The squirrel raised his head. He stared at her. Wow, said Flora. Great. Okay, I can't understand you, and that's a small problem, but we'll figure out a way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying. Like this. Flora nodded, and Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leapt up high in her chest. I'm going to try and explain what happened to you, okay? Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again, Flora's heart leapt up high inside of her in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. Don't hope, she told her heart. Do not hope, instead observe. Do not hope, instead observe was a piece of advice that appeared often in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. According to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from an all-you-can-eat buffet and you told yourself, man, I sure hope she's not choking, you would waste several valuable, life-saving, Heimlich maneuver performing seconds. Do not hope, instead observe were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. Okay, said Flora. She opened her eyes. She looked at the squirrel. What happened is that you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you might have powers. Ulysses gave her a questioning look. Do you know what a superhero is? The squirrel continued to stare at her. Right, said Flora. Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers, and he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who was also Incandesto. Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. Look, said Flora. She grabbed the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto off her desk. She pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. See, she said, this is Alfred, and he is an unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of the Paxatocket Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in his studio apartment with only his parakeet, Dolores, for company. Ulysses looked down at a picture of Alfred and then up at Flora. Okay, said Flora. So one day, Alfred takes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning solution factory, and he slips, Alfred T. Slipper, get it, into a gigantic vat of Incandesto, and it changes him. And so now, when there is a great crisis, when malfeasance is apparent, Alfred turns himself into. Flora flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at the panel that showed the glowing, powerful Incandesto. Incandesto, she said. See? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light, so painfully bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Flora realized that she was shouting, the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses. His eyes were enormous on his small face. Flora tried to sound calm, reasonable. She lowered her voice. As Incandesto, she said, Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. At least, I think you have powers. So far, all we know about you is that you're really strong. And then we see over here that Ulysses is looking at the comic book with Flora. Ulysses nodded. He puffed out his chest. Flora, her mother shouted. Get down here. Dinner is ready. But what else can you do? Said Flora to the squirrel. And if you truly are a superhero, how will you fight evil? Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down. She put her face close to his. Think about it, she said. Imagine what we might be able to do. Flora Bell, her mother shouted. I can hear you up there talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think that you're strange. I'm not talking to myself, Flora shouted. Well, then with whom are you speaking? A squirrel. And there was a long silence from down below. And then her mother shouted, That's not funny, Flora Bell. Get down here right now. Chapter 12, The Forces of Evil. When Flora came back upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses had curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put out her hand and touched his forehead with one finger. Her eyes twitched, but they didn't open. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved carefully to the foot of the bed. She changed into her pajamas, lay down, and imagined the words, a superhero squirrel rested at her feet, but she was not lonely at all. Emblazoned on the ceiling above her. That's exactly right, she said. Before the divorce, before her father had moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud to her from the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite comic. It always cheered him up to read about Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. Holy Bagoomba, he would say in the voice of Dolores. Holy unanticipated occurrences. Holy unanticipated occurrences was what Dolores would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at the sleeping squirrel. Wholly unanticipated occurrences, she said. It sounded better when her father said it. Not that he said it these days. He didn't say much of anything anymore. Her father had always been a sad, quiet man, but since the divorce, he had become even sadder and quieter, which was fine with Flora. Really, cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto manufacturing facility and had fallen into that vat of Incandesto, he hadn't said a single word, not even oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father had read those words to her so many times that she could recite them by heart. He is an unassuming janitor, but will he dare to battle the darkness of the universe? Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto. Flora lay back down. If the squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space over his head when he was sucked into the vacuum cleaner? He is an unassuming squirrel. Yep, but he will soon conquer villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak. That sounded good too. He will become known to the world as Ulysses. Holy Bagoomba. Anything could happen. Together, she and Ulysses could change the world. Or something. Do not hope. Instead, observe, Flora whispered to calm herself down. Just observe the squirrel. And then she fell asleep. Chapter 13, The Typewriter. He woke in darkness. His heart was beating very fast. Something had happened. What was it? He couldn't think. He was too hungry to think. He sat up and looked around the room. He was in bed, and Flora's feet were in his face. She was snoring. He could see the outline of her round head. He loved that head. But man, he was hungry. The door to the bedroom was open. Ulysses got off the pillow and went out of the room. He crept along the dark hallway. He went down the stairs and past the little shepherdess. The house was dark, but there was a light on in the kitchen. The kitchen! That was exactly where he needed to be. He put his nose up. He sniffed. He smelled something cheesy. Wonderful. He ran through the living room and the dining room and into the kitchen. He climbed up on the counter. And there it was, a lone cheese puff, perched on the edge of the red Formica countertop. He ate it. It was delicious. Maybe there were more cheese puffs. He opened a cabinet, and yes, there was a big bag with the beautiful words, Cheese-O-Mania, written in a golden script on the front of it. He ate until the bag was empty, and then he burped softly, gratefully. He looked around the kitchen. So we have our Cheese-O-Mania bag and a bottle of Incandesto. He's looking around. This is Flora's mother's precious typewriter. And this is Ulysses looking at the typewriter and thinking of something at the typewriter and typing something on the typewriter. Maybe it's something good. I hope he looks happy about it. I don't know how Flora's mom's gonna feel, and he's still typing. I can think of a word that starts with these two letters. In the darkened kitchen, the unassuming squirrel worked slowly. His whiskers trembled. His heart sang. Was he fighting evil? Who could say? Chapter 14, Squirtle. Flora Belle Buckman, get down here right now! Don't call me Flora Belle, Flora muttered. She opened her eyes. The room was bright with sunlight. She'd been dreaming something wonderful. What was it? She'd been dreaming about a squirrel. In her dream, he was flying with his legs straight out in front of him and his tail straight out behind him. He was a squirrel on his way to save someone. He looked supremely, magnificently heroic. Flora sat up and looked down at her feet. There was Ulysses, sleeping on the pillow. And did he look heroic? In fact, he was glowing, just like Incandesto, except oranger. He was extremely orange. What the heck? Said Flora. She leaned over Ulysses and reached out a finger to touch his ear. She held the finger up to the light. Cheese. He was covered in cheese dust. Uh-oh, said Flora. Flora! Her mother shouted. I'm not kidding. Get down here right now. Flora went down the stairs and past Marianne, whose cheeks were glowing a healthy and disgusting pink. You stupid lamp, said Flora. Now! Shouted Flora's mother. Flora broke into a trot. She found her mother standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, staring at the typewriter. What's this? Her mother said. She pointed at the typewriter. That's your typewriter, said Flora. She knew that her mother was absent-minded and preoccupied, but this was ridiculous. How could she not recognize her own typewriter? I know it's my typewriter, said her mother. I'm talking about the piece of paper in it. I'm talking about the words on the paper. Flora leaned forward. She squinted. She tried to make sense of the word typed on the top page. Squirtle. Squirtle, said Flora out loud. She felt a surge of delight at the zippy idiocy of the word. It was almost as good a word as tootie. Keep reading, said her mother. Squirtle, Flora said again. I am Ulysses, born anew. Do you think that's funny? Said her mother. Not really, said Flora. Her heart was beating very fast in her chest. She felt dizzy. I have told you and told you to leave this typewriter alone, said her mother. I didn't, said Flora. What goes on here is a serious business, said her mother. I am a professional writer. I am under deadline for this novel. There is no time. This is no time for hijinks. Plus, you ate a whole bag of cheese puffs. I did not, said Flora. Her mother pointed at the empty Cheese-O-Mania bag on the counter, and then she pointed at the typewriter. Flora's mother liked to point at things. You left cheese dust all over the typewriter. That's disrespectful. And you simply cannot eat a whole bag of cheese puffs. It's not healthy. You'll become stout. I didn't, said Flora, and then another wave of dizziness came over her. The squirrel could type. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. I'm sorry, said Flora in a small voice. Well, said her mother. She raised a finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately, the doorbell rang. Chapter 15, The Electric Chair. To say that the Buckman doorbell rang would be inaccurate. Something had happened to the bell. Its inner workings had become twisted, warped, confused, so that instead of emitting a pleasant ding or bong, the doorbell now sent an angry, window-shattering, you guessed the wrong answer on a game show kind of buzz through the Bunkman house. To Flora, the doorbell sounded like an electric chair. Not that she had ever heard an electric chair, but she had read about electric chairs in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. That particular installment of the comic had not contained any advice other than that it would be best to avoid getting to a place in your life where you might have to face the electric chair and any noises it was capable of making. Flora had found to be a vaguely threatening and not at all useful issue of terrible things. That's your father, said her mother. He rings that doorbell to make me feel guilty. The doorbell buzzed and crackled again. See, said her mother. Flora didn't see. How could one person ringing a doorbell make another person feel guilty? It was ridiculous. But then, just about everything that Flora's mother said or wrote sounded faintly ridiculous to Flora. For example, on feathered wings of joy. Since when did joy have feathered wings? Don't just stand there, Florabelle. Go open the door. Let him in. He's your father. He's here to see you, not me. The electric chair knelled the doorbell sounded through the house again. For the love of Pete, said her mother. What's he doing? Leaning on that thing? Go let him in, would you? Flora walked slowly through the dining room and into the living room. She shook her head in amazement. Upstairs, in her room, there was a squirrel who could lift a vacuum cleaner over his head with one paw. Upstairs, in her room, there was a squirrel who could type. Holy bagoomba, thought Flora. Things are going to change around here. We're going to be vanquishing villains left and right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. And that was the end of the third chapter section. So now we're actually going to go back to the section menu to find chapter 16. So we can read the next section for today. So just like before, it cuts off the chapter title of the first chapter in the chapter section. So chapter 16 is actually titled Victims of Extended Hallucinations. I wonder who that's going to be about. So chapter 16. It was not her father at the door. It was Tootie. Tootie Tickum, said Flora. Tootie stepped through the door and into the living room, and then she stopped. Her eyes widened. What in the world? She said. Flora didn't even bother turning around. She knew what Tootie was looking at. That's the little shepherdess, said Flora, the guardian of lost sheep and light, or something. She belongs to my mother. Right, said Tootie. She shook her head. Well, never mind about the lamp. She took another step closer to Flora. Where's the squirrel? Where's the squirrel? She whispered. Upstairs, Flora whispered back. I've come to check and see if I came to check and see if what I think happened yesterday actually happened, or if I'm the victim of an extended hallucination. Flora looked Tootie in the eye. She said, Ulysses can type. Who can type? Said Tootie. The squirrel. He's a superhero. Tootie said, for heaven's sake, what kind of superhero types? It was a good and also slightly disturbing point. How exactly was a typing squirrel going to fight villains and change the world? George? Shouted Flora's mother. It's not Pop, Flora shouted back. It's Mrs. Tickum. There was a silence from the kitchen, and then Flora's mother came into the living room with a big, fake adult smile plastered on her face. Mrs. Tickum, she said. What a lovely surprise. What can we do for you? Tootie smiled a big, fake adult smile back. Oh, she said, I just came to pay Flora a visit. Who? Flora, said Tootie. Your daughter. Really? Said Flora's mother. You came to see Flora? I'll be right back, said Flora. She ran out of the living room and through the dining room. What an extraordinary lamp, she heard Tootie say. Oh, do you like it? Said Flora's mother. Ha, thought Flora. And then she was out of the dining room and into the kitchen. She ripped the paper out of the typewriter and looked down at the words. They were absolutely not a hallucination. Holy bagoomba, said Flora. A loud scream echoed through the house. Flora took the paper and shoved it down the front of her pajamas and ran back to the living room. Ulysses was sitting on top of Marianne. Or rather, he was trying to sit on top of Marianne. His feet were scrambling to gain purchase on the little shepherdess's pink-flowered lampshade. He paused in his efforts and looked at Flora in an apologetic and hopeful way, and then he returned to wobbling back and forth. Oh my goodness, said Tootie. How did it get in here? Shouted Flora's mother. It just came flying down the stairs. Yes, said Tootie. She gave Flora a meaningful look. Flying. It absolutely scared the living daylights out of me and Mrs. Tickum. We screamed. We did, said Tootie. We screamed. There is just no end to the excitement. If that squirrel breaks my lamp, I don't know what I'll do. Marianne is very precious to me. Marianne, said Tootie. I'll just get him off the lamp, okay, said Flora. She put out a hand. Don't touch it, screamed her mother. It has a disease! The doorbell, as if it were echoing Flora's mother's advice, buzzed its terrible warning buzz. Flora and her mother and Tootie all turned. A small voice called out. The voice said, Great Aunt Tootie? And here we have Ulysses on top of Marianne's very beautiful lampshade. Chapter 17, I Smell Squirrel. There was a boy at the door. He was short, and his hair was so blonde that it looked almost white. His eyes were hidden behind enormous dark glasses. In addition to Terrible Things Can Happen to You, the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto regularly featured a second bonus comic called The Criminal Element is Among Us. The Criminal Element gave very specific pointers on how to never, ever be fooled by a criminal, and one of the oft-repeated dictums of The Criminal Element was that the best way to get to know a person was to look him or her directly in the eye. Flora tried to look the boy in the eye, but all she saw was a reflection of herself in his dark glasses. She looked short and uncertain, like an accordion in pajamas. William, said Tootie, I told you to stay put. I heard screaming, said the boy. His voice was high and thin. I was concerned. I came as fast as I could. Unfortunately, on the way over here, I had a small but extremely violent encounter with some variety of a shrub. And now I'm bleeding. I think I'm bleeding. I'm pretty sure I smell blood, but no one should be concerned. Please don't overreact. This, said Tootie, is my nephew. Great, nephew, said the boy, and I hope I don't need stitches. Do you think I need stitches? His name is William, said Tootie. William Spiver, actually, said Tootie's nephew. I prefer to be called William Spiver. It distinguishes me from the multiplicity of Williams in the world. He smiled. It's a pleasure to meet you, whoever you are. I would shake your hand, but as I said, I think I am bleeding. Also, I'm blind. You are not blind, said Tootie. I am suffering from a temporary blindness induced by trauma, said William Spiver. Temporary blindness induced by trauma. The words sent a chill down Flora's spine. Seemingly, there was no end to the things that could go wrong with human beings. Why hadn't Terrible Things Can Happen to You done an issue on temporary blindness induced by trauma, or for that matter, one on extended hallucinations? I am temporarily blind, said William Spiver again. How unfortunate, said Flora's mother. This is William. He's not blind, said Tootie, but as of this morning, he is staying with me for the summer. Imagine my surprise and excitement. I have nowhere else to go, Great Aunt Tootie, said William Spiver. You know that. I'm at the mercy of the winds of fate. Oh, said Flora's mother. She clapped her hands. How wonderful! A little friend for Flora. I do not need a little friend, said Flora. Of course you do, said her mother. She turned to Tootie. Flora is very lonely. She spends far too much time reading comics. I've tried to break her of the habit, but I'm very busy with my novel writing, and she is alone a lot. I'm worried that it has made her strange. I'm not strange, said Flora. This seemed like a safe statement to make when someone as truly, profoundly strange as William Spiver was standing beside her. I would be happy to be your friend, said William Spiver. Honored. He bowed. How lovely, said Flora's mother. Yes, said Flora. How lovely. The blind, said William Spiver, even the temporarily blind, have an excellent sense of smell. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Tootie. Here we go. I have to tell you that I smell something out of the ordinary, something that is not usually smelled within the confines of the human domestic sphere, said William Spiver. He cleared his throat. I smell squirrel. Squirrel? Confronted with the spectacle of William Spiver, they had forgotten about Ulysses. Flora and her mother and Tootie all turned and looked at Ulysses. He was on top of Marianne. He was still on top of Marianne. He had managed to balance himself on the small blue and green globe that was the center of the lampshade. That squirrel, said Flora's mother. He's rabid, diseased. He's got to go. Chapter 18, A Scientific Adventure. Why don't you let me take the squirrel? Tootie said to Flora's mother. I'll just return him to the wild. If you can call the backyard the wild, said William Spiver. Hush up, William, said Tootie. She reached out for Ulysses. Don't touch it, shrieked Flora's mother. Not without gloves. It has some sort of disease. If you could just get me some gloves then, said Tootie. I'll pluck the squirrel off the lampshade and whisk him out of here and set him free. The kids can come along. It will be a scientific adventure. It doesn't sound very scientific to me, said William Spiver. Well, said Flora's mother, I don't know. Florabelle's father is coming to pick her up for their Saturday visit. He'll be here any minute now, and she's still in her pajamas. Florabelle, said William Spiver. What a lovely, melodious name. It will all just take a minute, said Tootie, in a low, soothing voice. The kids can get to know each other. I'll get you some gloves, said Flora's mother. And so now here they were, walking over to Tootie's, getting to know each other, or something. Tootie had on a pair of dishwashing gloves that went all the way up to her elbows. The gloves were bright pink, and they glowed in a cheery, radioactive sort of way. In Tootie's gloved hands was Ulysses. Behind Tootie was Flora, and next to Flora was William Spiver. He had his hand rested on her shoulder. Do you mind, Florabelle? He had said. Would it trouble you terribly if I put my hand on your shoulder and allowed you to guide me back to Great Aunt Tootie's house? The world is a treacherous place when you can't see. Flora didn't bother pointing out to him that the world was a treacherous place when you could see. And speaking of the treacherousness, things were not in any way progressing as Flora had planned. She had envisioned Ulysses fighting crime, criminals, villainy, darkness, treachery. She had imagined him flying, holy bagoomba, through the world with her, Flora Buckman, at his side. Instead, here she was, leading a temporarily blind boy through her own backyard. It was anticlimactic, to say the least. Have you released the squirrel yet, Great Aunt Tootie? No, said Tootie, I have not. Why do I sense that there is more going on here than meets the eye, said William Spiver. Just keep quiet until we get back to the house, William, said Tootie. Can you do that? Keep quiet for a minute? Of course I can, said William Spiver. He sighed. I am a pro at keeping quiet. Flora doubted very much that this was true. William Spiver squeezed her shoulder. May I inquire how old you are, Florabelle? Don't squeeze my shoulder. I'm 10. I am 11 years old, said William Spiver, which surprises me, I must say. I feel much, much older than 11. Also, I know for a fact that I am smaller than your average 11-year-old. It may even be that I'm shrinking. Excessive trauma can retard growth. I'm not certain, however, if it can cause actual shrinkage. What was the traumatic event that turned you blind, said Flora. I prefer not to discuss it right now. I don't want to alarm you. It's not possible to alarm me, said Flora. I'm a cynic. Nothing in human nature surprises a cynic. So you say, said William Spiver. The word cryptic popped into Flora's head. It was preceded by the word unnecessarily. Unnecessarily cryptic, said Flora out loud. I beg your pardon, said William Spiver. But then they were at Tootie's house. They were walking through her backyard and into her kitchen, which smelled like bacon and lemons. Tootie put Ulysses down on the table. I don't understand, said William Spiver. We're back at your house, but I can still smell the squirrel. Flora took the paper out of her pajamas. She handed it to Tootie. She felt like a spy, a successful spy, a triumphant spy. A spy in pajamas. What's this? Said Tootie. It's proof that you aren't the victim of an extended hallucination, said Flora. Tootie held the paper with both hands. She stared at it. Squirtle, she said. Squirtle? Said William Spiver. Keep reading, said Flora. Squirtle, said Tootie. I am Ulysses, born anew. See, said Flora. What does that prove? Said William Spiver. What does that even mean? The squirrel's name is Ulysses, said Tootie. Wait a minute, said William Spiver. Are you posting that the squirrel typed those words? Positing? Positing? Yes, said Flora. That's exactly what I'm positing. The hallucination extends, said Tootie. What hallucination? Said William Spiver. The squirrel is a superhero hallucination. Surely you jest, said William Spiver. Ulysses sat up on his hind legs. He looked at William Spiver and then at Tootie, and finally he turned his eyes to Flora. He raised his eyebrows and gave her a look full of questions, full of hope. Flora felt a pang of doubt. He was, after all, just a squirrel. She had no proof that he was a superhero. What if there was some other explanation for those words? Also, there was Tootie's disturbing point to consider. What kind of superhero types? And then she thought about Alfred, how everyone had doubted him, how no one except the parakeet Dolores knew that he was incandesto, and how no one except Dolores truly believed in him. Was it Flora's job to believe in Ulysses? And what did it make her? A parakeet? Let me get this straight, said William Spiver. You, a self-professed cynic, are positing that the squirrel is a superhero. The words, do not hope, instead observe, flitted through Flora's brain. She took a deep breath. She pushed the phrase away. The squirrel typed those words, she said. Well, said William Spiver, whose hand was still on Flora's shoulder. Why didn't he move his hand? Let's just approach this scientifically. We'll put the squirrel in front of Great Aunt Tootie's computer, and we'll ask him to type. Again. Chapter 19, The Inadvertent Eye. He sat in front of the machine. It was different from Flora's mother's typewriter. There was a blank screen instead of paper, and the whole contraption glowed, emitting a warm but not entirely friendly smell. The keyboard was familiar, though. Each of the letters was there, each of them in the same place. Flora and Tootie stood behind him, and William Spiver, the boy with dark glasses, stood behind him too. This was an important moment. Ulysses understood that very well. Everything depended on him typing something. He had to do it for Flora. His whiskers trembled. He could feel them trembling. He could see them trembling. What could he do? He turned and sniffed his tail. There was nothing he could do except be himself, to try to make the letters on the keyboard speak the truth of his heart, to work to make them reveal the essence of the squirrel he was. But what was the truth? And what kind of squirrel was he? He looked around the room. There was a tall window, and outside the window was the green world and blue sky. Inside, there were shelves and shelves of books, and on the wall above the keyboard was a picture of a man and a woman floating over a city. They were suspended in a golden light. The man was holding the woman, and she had one arm flung out in front of her as if she were pointing the way home. Ulysses liked the woman's face. She reminded him of Flora. Looking at the painting made the squirrel feel warm inside, certain of something. Whoever had painted the picture loved the floating man and the floating woman. He loved the city they floated above. He loved the golden light. Just as Ulysses loved the green world outside, and the blue sky, and Flora's round head. His whiskers stopped trembling. What's happening? What's happening? Asked William Spiver. Nothing, said Flora. He's gone into some kind of trance. Oh. He's gone into some kind of trance, said Tootie. Shh, said Flora. Ulysses inched closer to the keyboard. It was beautiful to the squirrel to see a letter appear out of nowhere. Well, what is it? What's the letter? It's an I, William Spiver. But that proves nothing, of course. Anyone can inadvertently hit an I. You don't have to be a superhero to type an I. Would you please hush up, William? I-L-I-L-O. The squirrel typed. The people waited. Destiny bestirred itself. Chapter 20, What It Said. I love your round head, the brilliant green, the watching blue, these letters, this world, you. I am still very, very hungry. And those were chapters 11 to 19, right? Or 11 to 20. So that ends our second section for tonight, which means we've read the first 4 chapter sections, the first 20 chapters of our book. Tune in next week and we'll read the next 10 chapters. See you guys soon. Thanks for reading with me.